There are moments in geopolitics that don't announce themselves, moments that don't come wrapped in ceremony, explosions, or headlines. Instead, they detonate quietly in a conference hall, behind a podium, under soft stage lighting, and yet they shake nations harder than any missile ever could. And at the G20 Summit in South Africa, the world witnessed exactly that kind of moment. Not from the United States, not from China, not from the European Union, but from a nation long dismissed as polite, predictable, even peripheral, Canada. And the man at the center of this geopolitical quake was Prime Minister Mark Carney. He didn't walk in with bravado. He didn't theatrically slam papers or shout nationalist slogans. He didn't even raise his voice. But somehow, he took over the entire G20. He delivered a message so clear, so surgically precise, and so brutally honest that analysts around the world stopped mid-sentence. Leaders sat up straight, economists started scribbling notes, and commentators online lit up with one question: what just happened? Was this the moment Canada transformed from middle power to global architect? Was this the day a quiet nation stepped onto the world stage with a voice loud enough to reshape decades of geopolitical dynamics? Let's break it all down, with 8 cinematic, gripping sections that explain exactly how Carney stunned the world, and what it means for global power today. When Carney stepped onto the G20 stage, the room didn't erupt in applause. There was no dramatic entrance, no showmanship, no patriotic theatrics. But that was exactly what made the moment electrifying. Carney projected something world leaders didn't expect: calm dominance. The kind of composure only people who have shaped global systems, not merely talked about them, ever display. His tone was neither political nor emotional. It was strategic. He wasn't speaking to charm, he was speaking to correct. Within seconds, analysts recognized what was happening. This wasn't performance politics. This wasn't branding or messaging. This wasn't PR. This was authority earned, not manufactured. For years, Canada's global presence was overshadowed by personalities, scandals, memes, and theatrics. But Carney flipped the script. He didn't ask for respect, he commanded it. And the room responded like it was hearing from someone who belonged not among world leaders, but above them, as one of the architects of the global financial system. That's when the energy shifted, and the world leaned in. Transition. But what came next truly shocked the room, because Carney didn't start with diplomacy. He started with global instability, and he wielded it like a scalpel. Most world leaders tiptoe around global conflict. They minimize, they soften, they avoid specifics. Carney, he did the opposite. He spoke like a former central banker who has spent decades telling governments truths they do not want to hear. He dissected global instability: Ukraine, Sudan, rising authoritarianism, supply chain fractures, not as political crises, but as structural threats to global finance and economic security. Where others offered platitudes, Carney offered analysis. Where others sounded defensive, Carney sounded prepared. Where others spoke as politicians, Carney spoke as a strategist. He reframed geopolitical chaos as something measurable, predictable, and economically devastating. In his analysis, conflict wasn't about ideology. It was about markets, inflation, global food security, and the cost of doing business in a fractured world. And then, with surgical precision, he pivoted. Because this wasn't the message he came to deliver. This wasn't even the warning he wanted to highlight. Carney was leading the room somewhere far more explosive, a topic most world leaders weaponize for politics but few understand. Climate transition. And the way he reframed climate didn't just challenge the room, it detonated inside it. In a single sentence, Carney rewired the entire climate debate. Climate isn't activism, it isn't politics, it's economics. And suddenly the room froze. He wasn't speaking like an environmentalist. He wasn't speaking like a politician trying to score applause. He was speaking like someone who understands how global markets survive or collapse. Carney explained that what we once called rare disasters are now predictable disruptions. Wildfires aren't environmental stories, they're GDP stories. Floods aren't climate events, they're insurance and infrastructure failures. Hurricanes aren't freak incidents, they are nation-level fiscal threats. Then he dropped the statistic that hit the world like a punch. Canada's 2023 wildfires temporarily made the country the 4th largest emitter on Earth. Not because it was careless, but because climate shocks rewrite national balance sheets overnight. This wasn't climate activism. This was an economic forecast, and global leaders suddenly realized. Carney wasn't warning them about the environment. He was warning them about their economies, their budgets, their industries, their futures. Transition. But Carney wasn't done. The next shift turned climate from a warning into a strategic weapon for global competitiveness. Carney didn't leave the room drowning in fear. He pivoted sharply from crisis to opportunity. He framed climate not just as a threat, but as the next trillion-dollar global race. Countries that modernize will dominate the next century. Those that resist will drown in their own disasters. Carney outlined the tools: carbon markets, advanced climate financing, clean-tech infrastructure, cross-border carbon standards, and a global race for sustainable energy dominance. But then he delivered the line that sent shockwaves through the tech world. AI data centers should be required to run carbon neutral. That wasn't a policy idea. It was a blueprint for a future where clean energy isn't a political virtue, it's the ticket to operating modern technology. And in that moment, Carney positioned Canada as a potential global hub for carbon-neutral technology, AI infrastructure, and clean industrial scaling. This was no longer a climate conversation. This was a competition, transition. But if climate was the trillion-dollar race, Carney's next example showed the trillion-dollar cost of failing to prepare. Carney told a story not dramatic, not emotional, but devastating. He described Jamaica, a nation that spent years fixing its economy, cutting debt, improving its fiscal health, and earning international discipline. And then one hurricane erased nearly 40% of its GDP in a single blow. Not because Jamaica failed, not because it mismanaged, but because climate shocks don't respect economic discipline. Carney praised Jamaica for its reforms, then dismantled the illusion that fiscal responsibility can protect a nation from the new climate economy. The message was brutal. You can spend a decade repairing your balance sheet, but one storm can wipe out everything. This example didn't just silence the room. It forced world leaders to confront a terrifying truth. We're not preparing for climate events. We're preparing for climate economics. Protection isn't a moral choice. It's a financial survival strategy. Transition. But while the room absorbed the warning, analysts outside noticed something even bigger, a transformation in how Canada presents itself to the world. Back in Canada, analysts, journalists, and political commentators were stunned, not by what Carney said, but by what his performance represented. For years, Canada's global reputation was built on photo ops, social media moments, symbolic gestures, and surface-level diplomacy. Carney shattered that. He represented Canada with seriousness, credibility, and intellectual weight that the world hadn't seen from a Canadian leader in years. There were no gimmicks, no theatrics, no attempts to go viral. It was global leadership, not global marketing. Commentators noted that Carney wasn't analyzed for his outfit or jokes. He was studied for his strategy, for the deals he has quietly built across Europe, for the defense relationships he strengthened in Sweden, and for the geopolitical groundwork he has laid months before this summit. This wasn't tourism, this was statecraft. Canada looked credible, competent, influential, and analysts began asking a question Canada hasn't heard in decades. Is this the start of a new global era for Canada? Transition. But the most shocking part was still coming, because Carney did all of this without mentioning the United States once. This is where the geopolitical earthquake truly began. For decades, every Canadian foreign policy move was measured relative to the United States. Friendship, tension, trade, cooperation, it all orbited Washington. But at the G20, Carney didn't mention the U.S. not once, not in passing, not in contrast, not in caution. He spoke as though Canada were its own pole of global influence, independent and unmoved by America's gravitational pull. This subtle shift sent shockwaves through analysts. He didn't react to America, counter America, or seek America's approval. He simply spoke past them, as if Canada had evolved beyond being America's junior partner, as if Canada had entered its geopolitical adulthood. This is the moment observers called a turning point. Canada wasn't seeking validation. It wasn't positioning itself as reactive. It wasn't waiting for Washington to lead. Instead, Carney framed Canada as a proactive power, a nation with its own agenda, its own alliances, and its own global vision. Transition. But the world is left with a final question, one that could define this entire decade. Global leadership isn't built on one speech. It's built on patterns, consistent action, credible strategy, and repeated demonstration of influence. Carney's G20 performance wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a lucky moment captured on camera. It looked like the first chapter in something larger. The unveiling of a Canada that no longer waits for global powers to decide the agenda, no longer plays second fiddle to American volatility, no longer defines itself as a polite middle power, but instead charts independent policy, shapes global economic frameworks, and speaks with authority earned through decades of experience. The question now isn't whether Carney impressed the world. It's this. Is this the birth of a new era for Canada, or just a glimpse of the future the world hopes Canada will embrace? Because the next global crisis, climate, conflict, financial instability, will reveal whether Canada is ready to lead, or whether this moment was simply a spark waiting for its flame. Global leadership isn't built on one speech. It's built on patterns, consistent action, credible strategy, and repeated demonstration of influence. Carney's G20 performance wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a lucky moment captured on camera. It looked like the first chapter in something larger. The unveiling of a Canada that no longer waits for global powers to decide the agenda, no longer plays second fiddle to American volatility, no longer defines itself as a polite middle power, but instead charts independent policy, shapes global economic frameworks, and speaks with authority earned through decades of experience. The question now isn't whether Carney impressed the world. It's this. Is this the birth of a new era for Canada, or just a glimpse of the future the world hopes Canada will embrace? Because the next global crisis, climate, conflict, financial instability, will reveal whether Canada is ready to lead, or whether this moment was simply a spark waiting for its flame. Global leadership isn't built on one speech. It's built on patterns, consistent action, credible strategy, and repeated demonstration of influence. Carney's G20 performance wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a lucky moment captured on camera. It looked like the first chapter in something larger. The unveiling of a Canada that no longer waits for global powers to decide the agenda, no longer plays second fiddle to American volatility, no longer defines itself as a polite middle power, but instead charts independent policy, shapes global economic frameworks, and speaks with authority earned through decades of experience. The question now isn't whether Carney impressed the world. It's this. Is this the birth of a new era for Canada, or just a glimpse of the future the world hopes Canada will embrace? Because the next global crisis, climate, conflict, financial instability, will reveal whether Canada is ready to lead, or whether this moment was simply a spark waiting for its flame.